Hey everyone, welcome to our weekly discussion. Thanks for joining me. This week I thought because it's Erie County Fair week, it starts on Wednesday. Depending on when you're watching this, it's either in a few days or it's already begun over in Hamburg. And for most of us, a lot of us, we just call it the Hamburg Fair, right? Because it's been over in Hamburg for so many years. However, and I took for granted that people kind of knew this. The Erie County Fair actually was in East Aurora for 2 years, and this was a very, very long time ago by our standards of history. No one around today would have gone to the fair when it was in East Aurora. However, again, I take it for granted that people kind of knew this, and I was talking to somebody about it, and they said they didn't realize that the fair was here in East Aurora. We don't really have any um, uh, monuments or plaques or anything to show where it was. So I had done a little research a couple years ago about not only the fair is its early days, and you can read about that. There's some really great books about the Erie County Fair history. There's one of the Arcadia books that has lots of pictures in it, and another one that was put together in the early 2000s about the history of the fair, and those are readily available at local bookstores and at the fair itself that give you a lot of history of the Erie County Fair um, as a whole. But I want to focus, and I have focused in my research on the fair here in East Aurora. And believe it or not, history was made here because it was the first time that the fair was held outside of Buffalo. So in the early days, in the 1820s, the um, Agricultural Society had formed. They had two fairs, and then they were not annual events. It actually didn't come back around again until 1841, and the early fairs were held in Buffalo. One of the problems with that is that the transportation was really primitive back then until a train came through East Aurora after the Civil War, 1867. You had to go by horse and wagon to get anywhere. And so where the fair was held was a big deal. And so they had fairs in the city, what would have been then the city of Buffalo, but it would have been more of the size of a village at the time in the 1820s and then the 1840s. And so you would have to travel from here or points south. Think about towns like Concord and Sardinia. They're on the far outreaches. A lot of farms out there, and they would have a tough time getting to Buffalo. So they decided to move the fair around. And in 1850, the Agricultural Society voted to move it for the first time outside of Buffalo, and it came here to Aurora. And then it moved to Lancaster the year after that, and they moved it around East Hamburg, which is now Orchard Park. Um, so it was here in 1850, and it was also here in 1854. And that, just to put it in perspective, that is when, in 1850, Millard Fillmore was president. uh, so before the Civil War, we didn't have railroads that were readily available. So again, our railroad came in the 1860s. So moving the fair around, they thought would be helpful to get new people to come, especially farmers who had to go over very primitive roads. And that's what led to troubles with the earliest fairs in the 1820s. People just couldn't get from point A to point B very easily. So, um, and then later, as they moved the fair around, they finally settled on the Hamburg Fairgrounds, and they bought the land. The Agricultural Society bought the land. Much smaller parcel than it is today over in the village of Hamburg, but then it expanded. But before that, it moved around to several communities. Now, in 1850 and 1854, the fair would have been much different than what we think of what we know of a fair today. Obviously, there was no I Got It, and there was no carnival games. There would have been perhaps some food, but it was mostly an agricultural fair, being that the farmers would come and show off their animals, show off their crops. You would, there are stories of of them talking about bragging about their either a good crop or finding empathy when the crops weren't as good. And that social aspect of the fair can't be understated, where people were on these large farms by themselves, and to be able to come to a place and interact with people from other parts of the county was a huge deal, because it didn't happen often. Each small community had its own, perhaps, churches and social aspect within their small communities, but getting from one place to another was rather difficult. So for a while, as I researched, and actually the first time I wrote about the county fair here in East Aurora, I didn't know where it was. And actually the folks at the county fair, Erie County Fair, didn't know where it was when it was held here in East Aurora. And with the advent of digital newspapers and the help of a fellow researcher who pointed me in the right direction, I found an article that indicated that the Erie County Fair in 1850 and 1854 was held at Holmes Grove. Now, Holmes Grove is where Hamlin Park is today. And again, the fair, an article had indicated that the fair was held there, so that's how we know. There was speculation that the fair was held elsewhere on some other farm, perhaps up toward Main Street, and in fact, a lot of people say, and they come out, and it's been printed in a variety of places as well, that the fair was held on what was known as the East Aurora Fairgrounds on South Street. And you'll look, there's a 1909 map that actually shows the fair, excuse me, I think it's the 1880 map. The 1880 map of East Aurora that shows what is on the north side of South Street near Sycamore Street, the East Aurora Fairgrounds. And so people have put the two and two together that, oh, that must have been where the Erie County Fair was held when it was held here in the 1850s, 1850 and 1854. Totally two different fairs. Those fairgrounds weren't even around during the 1850s. That was a separate organization that was formed again after the railroad came here in the 1870s. An organization, a group of businessmen in town and farmers created what was known as the East Aurora Fair Association, created their own fair. And they bought fairgrounds down on South Street. So if you actually live on the north side of South Street, between Sycamore Street and the community pool, you were right where these fairgrounds were. They did hold an annual fair, and they tried to attract a lot of people to East Aurora, but one of the things that they did do very well was horse racing. They would have horse races there, baseball games. The fairgrounds became a meeting place, recreation place, for events throughout the summer. They would hold races throughout the summer. So it wasn't just the fair. And they took advantage of the railroad coming to East Aurora, and lots of people would come to East Aurora. And they would make money at the fair, of course, but it would also draw people to East Aurora. They would take train excursions down to come to the fairgrounds, and they would shop at the stores. And so some of the business owners in town were on the Fair Association board, but they made money at their business. So it was beneficial for themselves to make sure that Fair Association did well and that the fairs on those fairgrounds did well. That association dissolved fairly quickly, only lasted a couple years. So by the turn of the century, it was gone. So the fairgrounds that are on South Street are totally different than the Erie County Fair. So the fairgrounds on South Street were the East Aurora Fair Association, different fair, and the Erie County Fair was held in 1850 and 1854 at Holmes Grove, which today is Hamlin Park. And a few weeks ago, I was meeting with the children at the summer day camp at Hamlin Park, and that's one of the things we like to talk about because they feel like it's kind of exciting that the Erie County Fair was held right where they now have their park. Kind of interesting. So we do know from some accounts what happened at the 1850 fair, according to the reports, and that's one of the things the Fair Association, the Agriculture Association, did well, is have good records, and the newspapers would cover it. The Buffalo newspapers. We didn't have a local newspaper in 1850 and 1854 in East Aurora, but the Buffalo newspapers covered it pretty well because it was a big event, a county-wide event that drew lots of people. In fact, more than 8,000 people were said to have come to that fair. It only lasted a day or two. It wasn't a week and a half long thing like it is now. So 8,000 people is not a lot when you consider the fair today, but it was a lot. There were only a couple thousand people living in the village of East Aurora at the time. So to have 8,000 converge on East Aurora, and not on a train, they would have all come by horse or wagon to come to East Aurora with all their livestock. So according to the reports, it was the best attended to date before 1850, and there were 133 cattle, 89 horses, 73 sheep, and 23 hogs that were registered for the competitions at the fair, and that the premiums totaled $550. And they said that farm products were shown in great abundance, and that the ladies department was fully represented. So in addition to the agriculture, i.e. the animals and the crops, there was a ladies department that they could show off their handiwork, and there were prizes given out for that. That's why some of those elements of the Erie County Fair today remain the same, because they go back all the way to the beginning. So the fair was really successful here in Aurora, but then they moved, and then they brought it back here in 1854. But unfortunately, when it came back here in 1854, it wasn't as successful as the first one, according to the reports. They said a note of pessimism had crept into the fair, according to one of the reports, and the attendance wasn't as good. Poor roads were actually what they thought was part of the problem. And again, if you and a drought had added to the fact that the produce wasn't as good. So a lot of things went into the fact that the 1854 fair wasn't as good as the 1850 fair here in East Aurora. So again, they moved it around, and then they finally settled on Hamburg, and that was sort of it. Once it moved to Hamburg, the railroad, of course, comes through. It makes it easier for people to get from point A to point B, and they didn't need to necessarily move the fair around the county. And it was just easier to have a central point where you could keep things established, construct buildings, that sort of thing. So the fact that we could have had it in Aurora again, we actually lost out to Springville on one of the votes by only a couple votes of the board. But the fact that it was held here 2 times is pretty significant. Actually, we don't have anything at the park that denotes that the fair was held there. A lot of other very important things happened in Holmes Grove and Hamlin Park as well. We had famous baseball players play on the baseball diamond there. We have a very historic Hamlin Park if you really want to go back into the history. So we really don't. The fair was one of many wonderful events that have happened at the park. So we don't have a plaque there. But if you go to Orchard Park, where they had the fair, on the farm that it was there at the time was called East Hamburg. They do have a plaque there denoting that it was the fairgrounds in East Hamburg, for 1852. I believe the governor had spoken at that one, so they denote that as well. So a lot of us sometimes think when we talk about Hamburg Fair, we forget that in the earliest days of the fair it moved around, and that East Aurora is part of the fair in many ways, but most importantly perhaps that it was held here twice, in 1850 and 1854. So again, thanks for joining me. If you have any questions or comments, especially topic ideas, feel free to throw them in the comments or send me a private message. And enjoy the fair. And if you have any questions specifically about the fair, it's not too late. Just throw them in, and I'd be glad to try to answer them. Thanks again. We'll see you at the fair.